As we continue to prepare for paper one, what we always want to do is look at poetry and try to glean how the poet is achieving whatever it is that the poet is achieving. Now, the poem may have a really important theme or a really important, or it might be entertaining because of a character it develops, or it might just have complex philosophical ideas. Whatever it is that's in the poem, our job is always to look at the stylistic devices that the poet is using and describe how those devices contribute to the bigger picture whole. In other words, let's start with this poem. It's a great poem, but the question is, why is it a great poem? What's the author doing that's kind of amazing? I'll start off saying the things that I think a lot of you already noticed. This is definitely a Carpe Diem poem. In fact, this is the Carpe Diem poem. This is probably the most famous of all Carpe Diem poems. And its message really is live for today, live for now, because you don't know what the future is going to be. Well, you do know. Eventually it will be death. Um, in that sense, this is a Carpe Diem poem. Another important word to know when it comes to a poem like this is that it's didactic. In other words, didactic means it's trying to teach you something. And this poem, like many of the poems that we're studying right now, is definitely trying to teach its audience something important. You may not be a carpe diem kind of person, especially if you have college and things like that in front of you, but you should be aware that that's sort of the main idea in this poem. Structurally, without even really reading the poem, you should notice a few things. There are essentially four quatrains in this poem. It's a repeated pattern that goes every four lines, and it's actually really simple. It's a four line, it's just A B rhyme scheme, and that repeats four times. The other thing you should notice when you first start reading this poem is that it's very lyrical. And by lyrical, I mean it has a really steady meter. You can hear it as you read it. It's got a real clear, almost childlike rhythm to it. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a flying, and that same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. You can hear that real regular meter and that real regular rhyme scheme, and it makes the poem. I had to memorize this poem when I was in high school. I can't still do it, but I think it was easy to memorize because it does have that real regular meter and that real regular rhyme scheme. It also has a lot of internal rhyme, and all of these things come together to make this poem sound and feel a lot like a song. Look at the first line. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a flying. Rosebuds are clearly a symbol, and I hope everybody gets what a rosebud symbolizes. A rosebud isn't just a flower, it's the rose and its perfect youthful form. When you give flowers to your wife on Valentine's Day, you can't give her blooming roses. You have to give her a dozen rose buds because there's a perfection about them when they're buds. The truth is, the symbol is sort of here. Rosebuds are sort of where you are in life. You're at that perfect moment of youth. You're young, you're beautiful, you're ripe, everything's fresh. But the poem is trying to teach you something. Old time is personified, and old time is still a flying. The rhythm of this poem is almost clock-like. And it is teaching you that time is moving and time is going. And it personifies time. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of time personified. There's a couple of different ways to personify time. One is that you see this one on New Year's Day or New Year's Eve. He's an old man and he's carrying one of those sickles, which symbolize death. The other way time gets symbolized a lot is with Phoebus Apollo and his chariot pulled by four horsemen. that flies across the sky. That's the flying time. Time flies, tempus fugit, is part of the theme of this poem. It's not everything, it's what you should do because time flies. There is no stopping time. He begins with this metaphor, and he adds another metaphor to it in the same beginning quatrain. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. Well, rosebuds are flowers, but any flower does this. They bloom for a day or a very brief amount of time, and then the next day they're dead. The implication in the opening quatrain is that the same thing happens to us. We're born, we're youthful for a short amount of time. You're there right now, you better gather your rosebuds. But then we grow old, and then we die, and time passes. The conclusion is, if you know this fact, what should you do when you're young? Well, you should celebrate it. You should do something about it. The second quatrain begins with a second metaphor. It talks about this glorious lamp of heaven, the sun. It's not a very complicated metaphor. It's calling the sun a lamp of heaven. But then it personifies the sun, the higher he's a getting. And because it's using words like race and run, I sort of have that imagery of Apollo in my head. The higher he's a getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. Well, I mean, the imagery here is pretty obvious. It's the sun rising and the sun falling. But that is our lives too, and that's the metaphor in the poem. The sun rises and the sun sets. We're born, we live, we die. And these images sort of run parallel to it. That age is best, which is the first. I think there might be some truth to this. When you're young, when you're happy, when you're carefree, when, as according to the romantic poems, you look at nature with wonder and joy and enthusiasm. It's saying, the poem's very clearly saying that that age is best, which is the first. I think the poem means when you're young. And that's kind of a theme of this poem too. And that's something else that the poem's trying to teach. You see, it's trying to teach you to be happy now. Don't put your happiness off for another time. In order to be happy, you have to be happy. You can't put your happiness off. You can't decide you'll be happy when you're done with high school, or decide you'll be happy when you're done with college, or when you get a new job. The poem's trying to teach you to be happy now. And also, it's trying to teach you that you have something quite valuable now, your youth. That age is best, which is the first. When youth and blood are warmer. Yeah, when you're more passionate, when you're more emotional, when you're more whatever. What else could blood and be a symbol of? And then, as it transitions into the last quatrain, but being spent, and it means your youth, the worse, the worse. Here I would look at the redundant word choice. It just emphasizes the point that when you grow old, it's bad. And to tell you a secret, it's true. Times will succeed the former. So, the tone changes slightly in the last. It's like an argument. Each quatrain is a point. Point, point, point. But they're not dissimilar points. So what should you do? The magic turning word is then. Then be not coy. This lets me know that this poem is like To His Coy Mistress. Yeah, I think the poem's from a man and it's being written to a woman. I think this is another seduction poem like To His Coy Mistress. And just like that poem, this one is saying, Don't be coy. Don't play hard to get, but use your time. Enjoy, celebrate, be alive. And while ye may, go marry. I love that line because it has that real poetic movement. Unlike To His Coy Mistress, I think this is a really beautiful and romantic poem. Actually, To His Coy Mistress is sort of a satire of this poem. But this one is just saying it. We're only young once, we're only beautiful once, so what should we do? Well, then be not coy, but use your time. And while you may, go marry. In other words, do those things that make you happy. For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. The truth is, people grow old and they miss that time when they were young and they were beautiful. And if they didn't enjoy that time when they were young and beautiful, old people tend to really regret it. So, what do you do if you're doing a paper one? Well, you look at this poem really carefully and you figure out stylistically what choices is the author making. And then in an introductory paragraph, you would want to say how those choices are contributing to the main message of the poem. Now, this is a very simple poem. The main message is very clear. The speaker of the poem wants this woman to sleep with him. And I think he's giving her as good an argument as any that to do exactly that. It's interesting. One of the things about this poem that I enjoy is there's no feedback from the person that he's talking to. That makes the poem a little bit more general. Like any young person can say this to any other young person, and that's sort of the point. But I do love this poem really a lot. It's so beautiful, and it makes this really important point about carpe diem. Choose Something Like a Star by Robert Frost is actually a pretty famous poem. And Robert Frost, my God, he's a really famous poet. I'm sure he was born in like the 1870s, but he died about the same time I was born. And when he was alive, especially in his later life, he was, I would argue, probably one of the most famous poets in America, probably the most famous poet in America. This is an amazing poem, but it really does pay tribute to some of the romantic poets that are also in the packet that I gave you. It also pays tribute to Keats. Um, Keats specifically. Keats wrote a sonnet called Bright Star. Now, you're not really expected to know any of that. I just think it might come up. Um, what you are expected to do, and the skill that we are working on, is how can you read a poem like this and glean from it first of all, what you have to be able to do is read something like this and come up with what are the main themes, main ideas, main points of the poet. What's he trying to achieve here? And then the next question to ask is, what are the most important stylistic elements of the poem that help him achieve that? This poem, it's a big deal. I mean, in a way, it's a very simple poem. The meter is really simple. It's all iambic. It's got this real regular rhyme scheme. I mean, it varies a little bit, but it's also just this very musical poem. A lot of people sing this. A lot of choirs have done different arrangements where they just sing this because it's actually really beautiful what it is saying. The title is often misunderstood. It says, I mean, I don't know why, it's quite blunt. It says, choose something like a star. The question you have to ask is, what else is like a star? What else is there that's like a star? And that's sort of a big question. Like a star will work for what he's trying to teach, but it doesn't have to be a star. And it could be something different for different people. And he kind of gives you a hint of what else it could be right there in the first line. The first line is, O star, the fairest one in sight. Now, what you should recognize right away is he's addressing the star, and that makes this poem an apostrophe. Hopefully you got that. The other thing is, he starts with this O, and the O makes this sound like, O Lord, or O God. It sounds a little bit like a prayer, but he starts it not, he doesn't say, oh God, he says, oh star, the fairest one in sight. And so he's talking to this star in the abstraction, much like, as we do in prayer, you speak to God in the abstraction, and hopefully. He says, O star, the fairest one in sight, we, and you should start wondering, what does he mean by we? We grant your loftiness the right to some obscurity of cloud. It would not do to say of night, since dark is what brings out your light. This is actually a really good poem for the discussion of diction, because he's using words like loftiness. Loftiness has multiple layers of meaning. It could just mean above you, like the star. It is lofty, it is above us. But it also means greater than us or higher than us in other ways too. He says, we grant your loftiness the right to some obscurity of cloud. It's okay if at times you're obscured by the clouds, and we can't complain about the night because the dark is what brings out your light. So if you're looking at this poem with the connotations of the words, well, it's pretty straightforward. The clouds are always symbols of difficulties or troubles. And the darkness is that thing that we all have to get through. We have to get through the dark times in our life. But the clouds, which we can't complain about, and the darkness, which is what brings out the light of the star, those two things are important. So we start thinking about the symbolic, or really the connotative meanings of words like cloud and night and darkness and light, because all of those words have multiple layers of meaning. This is a poem about darkness and about light in their most symbolic sense. And then he has this sentence that says, some mystery becomes the proud. People interpret this line differently, but I think he's calling the star proud. And that's because there's something mysterious about the star. This poem would have been written in the early 1900s, but we had telescopes, we had science, we had knowledge, we knew what stars were. And then he uses this funny word. He says, some mystery becomes the proud. In other words, the star's proud, but it's also mysterious. And then he says, but to be wholly taciturn in your reserve is not allowed. Taciturn's a funny word. I learned it when I first started teaching. I was a young teacher, but the old teachers used the word taciturn to describe kids who don't talk or don't participate, or, who are so shy that they're just crippled. But he's saying To be wholly taciturn in your reserve is not allowed. It's almost like he's calling the star taciturn, quiet, shy, reserved. How can you be up there and still not be talking to us? I think some of you are starting to get what this poem is like. The star, or something like it, that is there, and it is lofty, and darkness or trouble is what brings it out. And the frustrating thing is the star itself is taciturn. It shouldn't be allowed. The tone changes when he starts with these alliterations. Say something to us that we can learn by heart and when alone repeat. In other words, give us something. Say something to us. Communicate with us. Say something. He screams it. And there's the caesura in the middle of the line. And it says, I burn. Okay. You look at the sun. I know it's not technically on fire, but it looks like it's on fire and it's burning, and that's what it says. But tell us more. Say what degree of heat. Talk Fahrenheit, talk centigrade. Use language we can comprehend. In other words, what can we know about stars? Well, we can know them scientifically. You can look up how hot they are or what chemical reactions are happening. And of course, it's very fascinating to learn that the sun is hydrogen converting into helium and where all the elements, but so what? We're looking at this thing and it says, I burn. And we can analyze it scientifically. But then you get this line. It gives us strangely little aid. I mean, it says, use language we can comprehend. Tell us what elements you blend. That's what stars do. But that doesn't help us. See, I see the word us here, and I think of it as the we up above. And where is it? Yeah, right here. We. Who's the we? Who's the us? Tell us what elements it gives. It says, it gives us strangely little aid. And I think that means we can understand these things scientifically, and it just doesn't help us. But does tell us something in the end, as steadfast as Keats' eremite. Now, Keats' eremite is an allusion to that John Keats sonnet. Eremite is a funny pronunciation of the word hermit. You don't need to know that. But Keats' eremite, well, you don't really need to know that allusion. But he talks about the star as if it's not even stooping from its sphere, it asks little of us here. In other words, this star is something that is distant and it doesn't ask anything of us here. It's a little bit like God. There's a disconnect. But it does ask of us a certain height. So when at times the mob is swayed, and I think the mob is us, I think it's humanity, and we carry praise or blame too far, that reminds me of that line that says, the world is too much with us late and soon. The idea then becomes that we can choose something like a star to stay our minds on and be stayed. In other words, the star is this, and it doesn't have to be a star, remember, it can be anything, but it would be that thing that you can remove yourself from the modern world and focus your mind and attention on as a means of escape. So this is his message. The question really is, how does he convey it structurally? I mean, think about this poem. What's he doing? It's actually very simple. He's using uh, the subject of his poem is this apostrophe, and he's using very sort of straightforward language, and he's trying to give us this example of, okay, there's this star, but all of these things sort of teach us, you know, we have to have a way to escape. We have to have a means of making ourselves, of staying ourselves. Choose something like a star. So the challenge that you have if you're in IB literature is looking at a poem like this and explaining how he's using these stylistic devices to convey this message. If I had to write a paper one over this, I would talk a lot about diction. I would talk a lot about word choice. I would talk about who the speaker of the poem is and who his actual intended audience is. I would talk about those vague pronouns and the fact that they actually really do mean us. And I would talk about this example that he gives of by personifying a star, how we can know things about it scientifically, but there is something greater that we can get from it.